Welcome to Scoop and Scale, where we dish up the science and weigh facts about mostly equine nutrition. I'm Jill Jackson, lifelong equestrian, podcast producer, and owner of 3 ponies. I'm a dressage rider and at-home horse keeper, living the challenge of managing 3 easy keepers on multiple acres of Iowa pasture.
And I'm equine nutrition consultant, Dr. Claire Tunis of Clarity Equine Nutrition. I develop diet plans for horses ranging from metabolic seniors to Olympic athletes. I also consult for equine nutrition companies. I'm a scientist, dressage rider, and pony club mom.
Claire and I have been horse friends for almost 20 years, and we've been collaborating on this podcast for the past year. And like most good horse friends, we're always talking horses. We're always talking about the challenges of managing our horses, our riding struggles, feeding horses, and what's going on in the wider equine community. This podcast is a place for us to have conversations mostly about equine nutrition. It's for anyone who wants to make better choices when it comes to feeding their horses.
And before we get started, a quick disclaimer. The information in this podcast is general and not meant to replace the individualized advice of your own qualified equine nutritionist or veterinarian. And while I have a PhD in nutrition, I'm not a veterinarian and can't give medical advice.
Thank you for joining us and hope you enjoy the following episode. In our last episode, we learned how to estimate our horse's weight and determine if it was good weight for them or not. So what's next? How do you use this information to make adjustments to your horse's diet? That is what we're going to talk about today. Hopefully everyone has their measurements ready. Claire, when you work with clients, where do you go next after you have this information?
If I'm meeting a client in person, I always start with getting my hands on the horse, taking the weight measurements and stuff, and then I go to the feed room. So I think it might be tempting for people kind of doing this at home to have realized, oh my gosh, my horse is underweight, my horse is overweight, and want to jump into making some decisions just on that information. But I continue getting more data. Like I don't have everything I need yet to really make fully informed decisions. So my next steps are always to look at everything that the horse is currently being fed. And guess what? Weigh all of that.
So that means weighing any hay that is being fed, as well as any grain and supplements, right?
Yes. And because forage should always be the largest part of the horse's diet, it's really important to weigh the hay. But interestingly, I find people sometimes forget about weighing the hay. Or, for example, I'll be doing a phone consultation with somebody and I ask them what they feed their horse and they tell me all about the grain and all the supplements and nothing about the hay. And I think sometimes that's because, especially if you board, you're often not in charge of the hay and not actually giving the hay yourself. And so it's sort of like out of sight, out of mind, that kind of just takes care of itself. And often actually they don't know what hay their horse is being fed. So if this is the case, then they obviously need to go talk to the barn owner.
I know from doing my own feeding that there can be a large difference in flake weight between the types of hay, the sizes of the bales, even between cuttings of the same hay. So I assume that this is why weighing the hay is actually important.
Yes, absolutely. And, there are some rules of thumb. Like, for example, like if you have the smaller, like 40-pound 2-string bales, those flakes in those bales when it's grass hay, kind of 3 to 4 pounds of flake. If you've got the big, like we get the big 110-pound 3-string bales, the flakes in those, if they're grass hay, tend to be more like 6 pounds. But there's always exceptions to the rule and there's big variability, even within the same bale. So I recommend that you weigh at least 3 flakes and then take an average. And of course, in an ideal world, all the hay is weighed every day before every feeding, but I appreciate that's not always going to happen. But, that would be ideal because of the variation and because of variation between batches. And that can actually be a reason for horses dropping weight is, if you're rigidly feeding by the flake, and the flakes get smaller and you don't adjust the amount you're feeding based on the kind of the weight of the flakes, horses can be fed the same number of flakes, but be getting much more or less hay. So yeah, the weighing thing is important, but I do appreciate that day to day is often, a lot of barns are not going to do that.
Some barns don't like their boarders going into the hay barn. So what do you do in that situation?
Yeah, I get that, right? If you have a big boarding facility, it could be mayhem with, owners going in and getting involved in the hay. And sometimes people start feeding their own horses willy-nilly, and you're running a business, that doesn't always work. So I get that sometimes that is a rule. Maybe the barn owner would be happy to go to the hay barn with you and kind of let you weigh some stuff. Or you could try and intercept the feeders if you're there at feeding time and ask them to hand you what they're feeding and weigh it before they give it to your horse. Actually, that's kind of a good thing to do anyway, because then you have a better idea of what your horse is actually being fed. Because I can't tell you how many times a stall sign will say something like 2 flakes of grass hay, but in reality, the feeders are doing something completely different. And at the end of the day, what one guy thinks is 2 flakes of grass may be different than the next. And I've certainly seen that happen too. And that can also put variability into your feeding program that can impact your horse's weight. So that's something to think about too if you're approaching this with a horse that you've identified as not having an ideal body weight.
I weigh my hay using a hay net because I feed in the hay net, and I use a fish scale. But are there other tips or tricks of weighing hay? And what if you don't have a net?
Yeah, fish scales are great, as the name suggests, right? They're used by people who go fishing to weigh their fish so they know how long they are. Did you know, does your fish scale, I only found this out recently, my fish scale has a tape measure in it as well.
Absolutely. As an angler, of course, when you hang the fish, you want to pull the tape down so you can get the length of the fish with the weight. Because if you're going to take a picture, you want to tell people it was a 5-pound bass and it was 18 inches.
Says Jill, who fishes off her dock. I do not fish, and I had no idea. And I was like, it was so exciting. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's a measuring tape in here. Anyway, I know. Whatever. I get, yeah.
It's very exciting.
It was a thing. I had no idea. It was very exciting. I had no idea. So yes, if you're ever in need of a measuring tape and you have a fish scale, you may find you have a handy one hidden in your scale. I actually don't use a fish scale. I use a digital luggage scale to measure hay. I love those. They're great. Maybe not so good day to day because I find the screen sometimes, the dust gets in the screen and then you can't read it. But for me, taking it out on the road every now and again, the luggage scales work great. And I can weigh my luggage if people give me things. While I'm traveling, like when I go to trade shows and I have like all these brochures and things to put in my suitcase, I can also measure my suitcase. The thing about it is that you have to make sure you're not weighing your hay net.
Correct.
So that is also a mistake people make, right? Is they put the hay in the hay net, weigh everything, not realizing that some of the hay nets weigh a pound.
Yeah, I have really heavy hay nets. Some of mine are at least a pound.
Wow, yeah. So with the luggage scale, maybe with some of the fancier fish scales, I don't know. But with the luggage scales, you can often what they call tear them and zero them out. So I will hang the net on the scale, tear it out, and then put my hay in it and then weigh it, and I have the true weight. Otherwise, you have to weigh your hay net first and then subtract that from the weight that you get. Another tip too is be careful when you're holding the hay up. You're not accidentally it's not touching the wall or your leg or something. It needs to be freely hanging or it won't be an accurate weight.
And another cold weather tip from Iowa, take your digital scale into the house, keep it in your pocket, because when it's really cold, those batteries die and you can't actually read them and they don't work.
That's a really good point. I would not have thought about that.
That's
Top
because
tips
you live in
for cold
Arizona.
weather with Jill.
Need cold weather tips? I'm your person. And are we trying to get the total amount of hay being fed per day for each type of hay being fed?
Yes. So you want the total amount of, say, alfalfa that you're feeding in a 24-hour period and the total amount of grass hay.
What about if your horse is free-fed or if it's on a round bale or eating pasture? How do you get that measurement?
That's a bit more tricky, right? But if you're going out and putting hay out in front of your horse all day long, whether that's loose or filling hay nets, I mean, if you're carrying it out there, you can weigh it before you take it out there. It's worth noting that you do have to account for hay that's not being consumed, because ultimately what we're interested in is what is your horse eating, right? There's a little thing in nutrition. We always say there's the diet that I make for a client, there's the diet that gets fed to the horse, and there's the diet that the horse actually eats. And what we're trying to get at is how much forage is the horse actually eating. So if you're putting, say, 50 pounds of hay outside every day, but they may only be eating 30 pounds of it if it's getting trampled into the mud and stuff. So you have to keep that in mind. And that's a little harder when they are kind of outside or in a big net type situation being fed that way. But you have to keep track of that, and you just have to do your best guess. If the horse is truly being free fed, so something like a round bale, there are some assumptions we can make, and obviously this isn't going to be as accurate, but it's the best we can do. So it's going to be somewhat tied to your horse's body condition. If your horse is at an ideal body condition, then we're going to assume that they're consuming enough calories in their total diet to make that happen. And we're going to assume that if they're in a free feeding situation, like with a round bale, that they're eating at least 1.5 to 2% of their body weight per day as forage, which is the ideal minimum intake per day. The same would be true if they're relying on pasture. In a pasture situation, if they're underconditioned, let's say, that would be an indicator that the pasture quality or the quantity that's available to them is not adequate. And in that situation, I would likely be looking to feed supplemental hay if none is already being fed. Conversely, if your horse is overconditioned, you've body condition scored it and it's higher than it should be, then we're going to start looking at restricting access to by either removing them from the pasture or using a muzzle. In the round bale situation, if the horse is underweight and they truly have unlimited access, then we would likely need to find additional calories from something else like a commercial feed, because hay alone clearly isn't adequate. But there are other considerations, of course. So, for example, horses that are out on round bales are often in groups. So maybe they aren't able to get to the bale due to the group dynamics, for example, in which case you're going to have to consider changing your management strategy, perhaps in a bigger way.
Really quickly, when you say overconditioned and underconditioned, you mean overweight and underweight?
Yes. Well, yes, I guess I do. I'm referring to you've body condition score them and they're outside of that ideal range that we identified in our last episode. And so, yes, if you've decided that they're a 4 and you want them to be a 5, or if they're a 7.5 and you want them to be a 6, right? That's what we're talking about. But yes, great question to clarify that for people.
So how do you tell how much hay your horse is eating if it is fed in a group?
It's funny. I love horses getting to be out and be in a group with their friends, socializing. I really think that's how horses should live. As a nutritionist, it gets so tricky, right? Because I really don't know what they're eating at that point. My job is so much easier if they're in a stall and they're getting given specific meals every day, because then we know exactly what they're getting to eat. But yeah, you're going to have to make some big assumptions if they're just out in a group. So you can do things like, you put a 100-pound bale out once a day or every 2 days or whatever, and you know how many horses you have out there, and you just divide that weight by the number of horses across the time period that they have access to that bale. And you make the assumption that they're all eating the same amount, which I understand is not accurate, because you're going to have that herd dynamic and some would just eat more and some don't have as much appetite, or they don't get to spend as much time. So we are guessing, but that's the sort of assumption you're going to have to make in that situation. And if that's working for your horse, you'll know based on their body condition score, right? If their body condition score is really good, then whatever you're putting out there is working for that horse. But there's going to be that range, right, of horses, that sort of bell curve in a group situation. And it's not uncommon to have one that's a bit overweight on the one end and then the skinny one on the other end. And that's a challenging management issue to deal with, but that's very common.
Another thing to say is that if you've got to the point that you've body conditioned your horse and you are to the point that you're actually trying to weigh this, you're already 95% there. Like, take the guess, right? Because so many people don't even bother to do this. Which is so important. So if you're like standing out there looking at your bale and go trying to do some math, kudos to you, because you're actually doing the work. So do your best, take a guess. We're going to go off it again. You're going to use the condition of your horse to help you know if it's the right amount. I think we've pretty much covered weighing hay to determine forage intake. So what's next? Grain?
Yes. So I'm going to go weigh all the other feeds that are being fed, all the commercial feeds, the balancers, the senior feeds, the supplements, all of it, right? And each one needs to be weighed on its own. So if you are somebody who, like I am, in a barn situation where you make baggies and mix everything together, I'm looking for the individual things that went into that bag, not the weight of the end result. Right. So it's important that you weigh each thing individually, like, so that I know they get 1.5 pounds of senior a day and 30 ounces of salt. 30 ounces of salt. That would be a lot
Holy
of salt.
mackerel.
Hopefully you're not feeding
30 ounces of salt. Don't
30
do it.
grams of salt, that kind of a thing. That's what we need to know. The weight of the individual things. If you're giving 30 ounces of salt, though, if you're weighing it, you're going to identify that issue. So again, that's why we do this. Moving on.
I use a digital kitchen scale for weighing my grain, and it works really well. And fun fact again, cold weather, if you're going to use digital in the winter, the batteries
Take it
don't
back.
work.
Put it back
Take it
in
in
your
the
kitchen.
But just to say that, so I don't weigh every single time I feed. I feed the same. I'm only feeding 2 horses. I feed the same horses. I use the same scoop, and I've marked the weights because I always use the same scoop on there so that I know where 1 pound is, 2 pound is, so that I don't have to keep. So each feed brand, like each specific feed has its own scoop. And I feed such a small amount, it's not a scoop, it's a cup. But anyway, go on.
No, that's one of my top tips. So absolutely. In fact, you can just use I've used old yogurt containers, the kind of larger yogurt containers. Anything that's like a cylinder, whatever you're using. I like cylindrical things because like some of the traditional scoops, like there's metal scoops and stuff, it's kind of, you can't really measure in that very well. You need a cylinder of some sort. Yeah, just take that Sharpie line and put a line on it. You measure a pound or whatever it is you need to feed, and then every time from then on, just fill it to that line. You don't have to have the scale out there all the time. So that's a great tip. So, I like the digital scales because they go down to such small amounts. They often go down to like individual grams. So really useful for making sure you're not feeding 30 ounces of salt. The luggage scales and fish scales are great for doing your grains, your hay pellets, that kind of thing. Beet pulp, all those sorts of things.
We've weighed everything now. So what's next?
Yeah, we've got the weights on everything, right? The horse, the forage, all the feeds you're feeding, your supplements. And now it's time to go sit at your kitchen table. If you're me, you're going to make a cup of tea and get a pen and paper and do some analysis. So first, you're going to take your horse's weight and you're going to determine what 1.5 or 2% of its body weight is. So let's say it's an 1,150 pound horse. You're going to multiply 1,150 pounds by 0.015, which will give you 17.25 pounds, right? So that's 1.5% of that horse's body weight. 2% of their body weight would be 23 pounds. So this is how much forage your horse is ideally eating at a minimum. They can always eat more than that, right? But ideally at a minimum, that's how much you're feeding. So now you're going to check and see how much hay you're actually feeding your horse because you already just went and weighed all that. Does it match, right? Are you, in fact, feeding your 1,150 pound horse at least 17 pounds of forage? If you're feeding hay pellets or beet pulp, right, those count towards your forage, right? Those are roughages. So you can add that in with your hay amount to get your total forage. But know that the weight of beet pulp, it needs to be a dry weight. So most of the time we're soaking our beet pulp before we weigh it. We need the dry weight.
What about when you're soaking hay? Is that the dry or the wet weight?
Yeah, so somebody like you're soaking your hay, again, dry weight. Otherwise, you're just weighing a lot of water, right? So beet pulp, soaked hay, all these, it's the dry weight.
And what about the grain weights? What are we going to do with those?
So you need the feeding instructions for the fortified feeds that you're feeding.
So I probably should have brought the feed tags into my house with me when I came inside to do the calculations.
Yeah, hopefully though, maybe you can find it online. I don't know. Hopefully in your case, you don't have to go trudging back out in the cold to go get that information. But yes, whatever, online, on the feed bag, you need the feeding directions and you're going to see what the manufacturer recommends for a horse that weighs what your horse weighs. And sometimes those are also based on work levels. So let's say you might need to know if your horse is working, not working. Is it moderate work, light work? Is it a pregnant mare? Is it a yearling? You have to know that about the horse to find the feeding directions for that particular feed. And it's important that you can compare what you found you're weighing. Let's say you're feeding 2 pounds of senior. How does that compare to the feeding recommendations on this bag of senior that you're feeding for your 1,150 pound horse, let's say in light work? Is their recommendation 2 pounds? If it is, great. I'm guessing it probably won't be if it's a senior feed. Then again, you're going to know, are you following the feeding directions or not? And if you're not, then you probably have some adjustments you need to make in your diet because the diet probably is missing some key nutrients.
So let me throw some scenarios at you and let's see what you would decide to do with them.
Okie doke.
So my horse is an ideal weight. I'm feeding the ideal minimum amount of forage and I'm feeding a performance feed, but it's less than the manufacturer says I should be feeding.
Yeah, so it's going to be a little bit like that senior feed that I was just talking about, right? So we know that you're giving your horse the right number of calories because your horse's weight is ideal and they're in good body condition. Well, they're in good body condition, so we know their weight is ideal. Let me put it that way. And we know they're getting enough forage for gut health, which is why we say we need to feed 1.5 to 2% of their body weight as forage, because that's how, actually, interestingly enough, that's kind of how much they eat on their own as dry matter when they're left to their own devices. So we're just basing that on what horses choose to do naturally. So we like to keep that much forage in their gut for gut health. And we also know that unless you're feeding a bunch of supplements, the diet is probably lacking in adequate trace minerals and vitamins because you aren't feeding the commercial feed properly, right? So the commercial feed is going to say 6, 7, 8, 9 pounds a day, and you're not feeding that much. So you're going to be missing some key nutrients. So you need to find a commercial feed in this situation that you can feed at the right amount, because clearly your horse is doing fine on a forage-based diet, maintaining its weight just fine on a forage-based diet, and really a very little amount of performance feed. And so you'd be better off doing a balancer, and then that will give you most of the vitamins and minerals you need. And you may find that you don't need all the supplements that you've been feeding. And it's going to depend on what those supplements are and your individual horse and what you have going on and why you're feeding those supplements. So if you're not sure about whether you still need those supplements after you make that diet change, that's a great situation where you might choose to work with a nutritionist.
Yes, they could really help you decide if you need to be using all those now and probably would save you money. Okay, next scenario, my horse is underweight.
Okay, so I would be checking kind of some of the following things, asking myself some of these questions, right? Am I feeding the minimum amount of forage? If not, I'd start off by feeding more forage. If I am feeding more than that, if you're feeding more than the minimum, and maybe you're feeding quite a lot more than the minimum and your horse is still underweight, then I'd be looking to add like a higher calorie senior or performance type feed. How much of that's going to depend on how underweight the horse is. If I'm already feeding one of these feeds, but it's below the recommended amount, I'm probably going to increase the amount to the recommended level and see if that helps. I might also look at things like forage quality. So maybe you're feeding plenty of forage and the horse is underweight, but the quality of the forage is such that they just really can't access all the nutrition in that forage. Maybe it's a sort of a late cut stemmy hay, and this is a slightly harder keeper type horse, and they would benefit from being on something that's more digestible. Or maybe you only have them on grass hay, and another way to get some calories into them would be to either substitute some of that hay or add on top of what you're doing already some alfalfa, because alfalfa has more calories per pound. So there are quite a few options you can have available to you for the underweight horse, but those are some of the, armed with the knowledge of the feeding instructions on the feed and the amount of forage that I'm feeding, you can start to identify where the problem might be, assuming that it is a dietary issue and not something like the horse that needs its teeth done.
And you are going to do this slow and steady, one thing at a time. Don't throw more hay, more grain, more new alfalfa all at once.
Right. Absolutely. That's a great point. Yeah, just pick one and do it. And, if it's working, you should start to see some changes in a couple of weeks. And you're going to be continuing to weigh and body condition score that horse. So even subtle changes that you might not see visually, you might pick up on after, say, 2-3 weeks, because you're going to be putting a tape on and recalculating your weight and doing all that stuff. So again, that's the benefit of using this system.
Okay, what if your horse is overweight?
These can sometimes be trickier, right? I sometimes feel it's harder to take calories away than it is to add them. But again, since we want to leave as much forage in the diet as possible, I'm going to start off with any concentrate feed. So if your horse is overweight and you're feeding a couple of pounds of a high calorie performance or senior feed, then I'd be looking to get rid of that, right? I'd want to leave the forage alone if I can and get rid of, if you're feeding oils, really high, like calorie dense, right? If you're feeding these high calorie performance feeds, that's where I'm going to make my cut first. Obviously, you still want to have that source of vitamins and minerals in the diet. So it might be substituting that higher fat, higher calorie performance feed for a balancer again that's, doesn't bring a lot of calories to the table. If you're only feeding forage, and I'm feeding more than the recommended amount of forage, or, I'm feeding more than the minimum, right? So I'm feeding more than, like, say, 1.5-2% of body weight, then you could take some forage away. But I'm not going to take forage away and leave 3 pounds of senior in the diet, right? Or 3 pounds of performance feed. I would take the performance feed away first because I want to maximize the amount of forage for as long as possible, right? Because it's really important for gut health and the horse's mental health too. If I am going to reduce the forage, then I might decide that I'm going to put what forage I am feeding in some kind of slow feeder, right? So that psychologically the horse isn't as aware of their reduction.
And as a pony owner, I'm just going to add that sometimes they're not getting anything except for forage, and they're already getting a really small amount of forage, and they're already getting fed in a slow feeder, and you still need to cut down the calories. There's lots of people on the slow feeder pages that, not in the winter, but in the summer, they still have their ponies eating out of a slow feeder and they have the grazing muzzle on. Sometimes they double bag the nets. So you've got 2 separate nets on your hay. So they're still eating slower. Maybe you're feeding in a 1.5 inch and you need to go down to a 1 inch net. So you can still try to slow down how much they're eating by just using the nets if you have just a forage-based diet. Pony problems.
No, absolutely. But I also want to throw out there, I think it's an important thing to say at this point, especially with the overweight horses, how much are they working? How much are they moving? How many calories are they burning? Again, like I'm a big believer in keeping as much forage in front of horses as I can. So when I'm dealing with an overweight horse, if it's sound, make it move. Get it burning some calories. I would rather do that than cut its forage back. Like don't wait until, if it's like a pony, it's laminitic and then it can't move because it's lame. Get it moving and burning some calories. And then, let's be honest, I mean, that's why if I go to the gym, that's why I go to the gym, is so I can eat more, right? I mean, let's be honest.
Fair enough.
It works for horses. It works for horses too.
But
so, did we mention that we have an episode on slow feeders?
We do. Episode 35 is on slow feeders. You can look into track systems if you need to get those horses moving. I have a pony that's feral. He's halter broke, but I don't ride him. Nobody rides him. He gets to walk around from net to net to net. He's moving and he's turned out. But we do have a client that she has a mini and she uses her golf cart, right? I mean, we loved that.
Yeah.
And that pony looked great. And she just, the pony walked next to her on the golf cart and she just took it around to get it some exercise.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So you can get creative.
You can. I think that's the thing. Is like you have to really open your mind sometimes. But just to say, you mentioned muzzles, but yeah, I mean, if they're on pasture, right? You're looking at muzzles. You're looking at taking them out of the pasture. All those kinds of things. Dry lot, hay to reduce calorie intake. But again, it's still important to be adding a balancer or some other source of nutrient fortification for these guys because when they're on such low calorie intakes, they can be really nutrient deficient. So that is an important part. And again, these horses can be tricky. Reach out to help from a qualified professional if you need it.
Obviously, there is a lot of nuance to all of this.
Yeah, big generalizations we're making here and kind of broad recommendations that I'm making. But in reality, you have to take into a lot more account, other things that we haven't really mentioned here, like the work level, like the health history, that kind of a thing. So, for example, if I'm told that an underweight horse has a history of ulcers or GI issues, then I might be looking for products that are going to support gut health, so they're better able to use the diet they're being fed. So, really what I've just given a few general suggestions sort of at a glance to show kind of how I approach using weight and body condition to be able to assess diets and know whether you need to make changes or not.
This is the part that I always say to you, is there anything else you want to add before you go? But I want to add something before we go. And that is when you see people on social media say, my horse is underweight, what should I feed them? And everybody chimes in with every single food, oil, grandma's old trick to get weight on your horse. Just sit back and say, how can anybody make this assessment when we don't know how old it is? We don't know if it's in work. We haven't seen the horse. We don't know its body condition. There's no scoring done. So be very leery when you go to social media asking for help, or when you see those posts for people asking for help. Between this episode and the episode we did prior, hopefully now everybody knows how much information is needed to actually make decisions before adjusting a horse's diet.
I often don't respond to those kinds of posts because they're just a minefield.
I don't either.
If I do, I'm normally responding with more questions, not an answer or a solution because they never give, enough information to be able to give an informed decision. So no, you're absolutely right. And I just really hope that we've shone a bit of light on how useful knowing your horse's body weight and condition can be, and also how to kind of step back and critically assess your horse's diet. And it can be overwhelming. And I think it's important for our listeners to know that, there are qualified equine nutritionists out there. And, sometimes, ignorance is bliss. And it's not until you sort of like peel the Band-Aid off or whatever that you're like, oh, whoa, like I didn't even realize I had a problem or, whatever. And then you maybe feel a little bit like, and now I really don't know how to fix it. So, if you're feeling overwhelmed at all by any of this, reach out to somebody who's qualified who can help you and get you going in the right direction.
And also, I will put a post up on social media. If anybody if they're doing their measurements, if they have questions once they get going with this, ask us.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'd be happy to share what you found on our, Scoop and Scale page, and we'll chime in and kind of try and answer any questions that you have. Absolutely.
Okay, so here you go. Is there anything else you want to add before we go?
Nope, I think that was all of it.
Good. Then for listeners, if you'd like to be a part of our conversation, please send your suggestions for future topics and equine nutrition questions to info@scoopandscale.com, and is spelled out. You can also find Claire at ClarityEquine.com.
I guess I would actually just add something, and that is Happy New Year to everybody.
We are recording this ahead of time, and yes, so we were really bad about missing the happy holidays on the last one. So yes, Happy New Year to everybody, and here's to a wonderful 2025.
Yes, and don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on whatever platform you enjoy subscribing and listening to your podcasts on. Tell your friends about us so they can join in the fun in 2025 as well.
For the Scoop and Scale podcast, I'm Jill Jackson.
And I'm Dr. Claire Tunis.
Thanks for riding along with us.